Yep.
Perfect. Brilliant. How do I close that up? Hold on a second. Cool. There we go. Good. Well, for those of you that missed the meetings a couple of months ago, James had the cracking idea of us doing a joint presentation on brewing triple IPAs, because we've both done one relatively recently. I guess as well, this might prove a useful template for lab talks in the future, just to grab a couple of brewers and pick an individual style. It's easy enough to do, and we're always getting questions about recipes and recommendations, so that might work quite well. Triple IPA, I think, is quite an interesting style. There's plenty of challenges for the brewer, both in terms of the amount of malt you're trying to get in there and the amount of hops. It's an opportunity to use some new brewing products and possibly some new methods that you've not tried before. I should probably say up front, as a bit of a disclaimer, 80% of this talk focuses on the sort of the classic West Coast version of the style. I have tried to include a nod at the end of each section for the hazy versions, but given that the exemplars of the style remain West Coast, and that's what James and I brewed, you'll have to forgive us for that. And then, lastly, why don't we do questions as we go along this time? I know we normally do them at the end, but why don't, if anyone's got a question, why don't they just either unmute themselves and shout out, or stick it in the chat, and maybe either James or myself, depending on who's not talking, or anyone else could just give us a nudge that there's a question waiting. In fact, it will have to be someone else because I can't actually see the chat. So yeah,
I'll monitor the chat and everything. So
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if it's something that I know is going to get covered later on, maybe we'll leave it, and that's fine. But I just think it might be a bit livelier to deal with questions as we go along. What are we going to cover tonight? Can I make the presentation work tonight? There we go. There's some helpful arrows. So what are we going to run through? A little bit of history and background on Triple IPA and what we think it is, given that there's no BJCP definition at the moment. We thought we'd run through some classic examples, both US and UK, and then spend probably the bulk of the presentation on how to brew one. So the malt bill, the hops, the various aspects of the brewing process, all the way through enzymes, fermentation, right the way through to post-fermentation, and then mop up anything that we haven't covered in the recipes that we've brewed before, and then one other that I've pulled out to cover hazies. So that is the plan. Is there anything you wanted to add, James, before we push on?
No, I mean, I just can say, like, to your point about sort of the West Coast versus hazy. I mean, yeah, what we've done is I think inspired by older beers anyway, and I guess it's easier to just sort of talk about what you know, really, and what we've actually brewed. So yeah, we can come back and do one about hazies in future
if we have to. Not the glitter then.
Yeah, with everything.
Okay, so let's move on then. So what is a triple IPA? So maybe a little bit of history first. So in around about the 1990s, in the States, IPA was already really well established. It was in a lot of brew pubs by then. In about 1994, Vinny Cilurzo brewed what is supposedly the first double IPA at his Blind Pig brew pub in Tecumseh. And that became then Pliny the Elder, which he brewed at Russian River in 2000. And he brewed that for a festival that is held by a little brew pub in Hayward, San Francisco, California, called The Bistro. And they have done for the past 22 years now an IPA and a double IPA festival every year. And brewers from all over the States send in beers to that. It's pretty famous. I think it's the precursor to San Francisco Beer Week. In about 2003, Dogfish Head were probably brought out one of the first beers that was considered anything like a triple IPA, but it was very malty and much closer to a barley wine. So leaving that aside, in 2005, Vinny came back and brewed Pliny the Younger, which was basically like Pliny the Elder, but on steroids, much less malty than the Dogfish Head 120 minutes, and very much all about the hops. At about the same time, the festival added a Triple IPA category. And since then, loads of breweries, including Heretic, Russian River, loads of them now have a seasonal, an annual release of their Triple IPAs just for the festival at the bistro. I guess core Triple IPAs are relatively rare, just given the strength of the beer, and so most of them are seasonal releases. And the festival now, interestingly, includes two styles. They have a West Coast Classic section, which, as you can imagine, is sort of resinous, dank, citrus, nice and bitter, relatively clear beers. You've got to allow for dry hopping, creating a little bit of haze in some of them. And they also have a hazy section, which caters for sort of, I guess, amped up New England versions of the style. So much fruitier, much less bitter, very, very cloudy, and probably a lot bigger bodied. And those are the two camps of IPA that they cover for the festival. There is no current BJCP definition for Triple IPAs, but it's pretty easy to extrapolate. So whereas IPAs would take you from, let's say, between 5.5% to 7.5%, double IPAs then would pick up 7.5% and take you all the way up to 10. Triple IPAs then carry on between 10 and 12%. And then 12 to 14%, you might end up with a quadruple IPAs. And I have seen, probably self-proclaimed, but a quintuple IPA at about 15. And all of them are simply exaggerated versions of, well, IPAs, I suppose, at the base, but with a triple, it's just like an exaggerated double IPA. So it remains dry, very bitter. There's very little malt going on, especially in the modern versions. It's all about the hops. And probably like most strong American beers, the key is to keep that drinkability, to keep them nice and quaffable, which means attenuating them really well. I guess, well, maybe not as much as a Belgian, but it's a similar idea, so that you don't end up with a great big body. You're not looking for a barley wine. So for a West Coast example, you're probably looking around 1008, 1010 as a final gravity, and nice and bitter, probably West Coast anywhere between 80 and 100 IBUs.
More than that. Yeah, I mean, to give my point to it, I know that the classic, which is a lot of people look for, which is Pliny the Younger, supposedly finishes at 1008. It doesn't supposedly taste as anywhere as dry as that, because alcohol carries an awful lot of sweetness and body, and when you're drinking a 10% plus beer, it's going to offset anything in terms of dryness and even the bitterness. 100 plus IBUs definitely, but it won't taste like that. They're generally, it's never going to be sort of raspingly bitter. It's very bitter normally, but there's normally offset by the sort of body and sweetness that's being carried by the alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, 1008 for a beer that starts at 1100 is going to taste very, very different in terms of the percentage of residual sugars you're left with than 1008 for a session bitter. So even with the 08 left, that's an awful lot of residual sugars. And so, yeah, like I say, for the festival, modern examples, you've got both West Coast and hazy. Yeah, let's go on to some of the classic examples. But like I say, if anyone's got questions, yeah, do holler as and when. So, classic examples. So the US has got a predictably wider variety of the beers, and a lot more of them are what I'd probably call old school examples. The exemplar is still probably Pliny, Pliny the Younger, which is, as I mentioned earlier, it's like a bigger version of Elder. It's about the color of a Pilsner. It's crisp, it's dry, it's relatively aggressively bitter, I suppose. I think it starts out at 1088. It's about 10.5%. It's all resin and citrus, grapefruit. There's not that much sweetness going on. And yeah, it's all about the hops. Heretic have quite a famous brew that they put together. So Jamil Zainasheff does a sort of a collab brew with Mitch Steele, and he used to do it with Tasty McDowell whilst he was still alive. That's a bigger beer. It's 11.5%. And again, it's quite piney and dank. It's very pale. It's softer, interestingly, than younger. It's a softer overall hopping, and there's probably a bit more malt flavour going on. And the bitterness is sort of a bit less. It lingers less. It doesn't stick to your mouth as much. It reminds me, it reminds me of those sort of West Coast beers that have been influenced now by New England's. In terms of what they've just reined in the bitterness a bit, made it a bit smoother. And then there are loads of places doing hazy versions, all sorts of those going on. The UK, I must admit, I've not tried that many UK examples, but almost all of them that I have been hazy versions. We don't seem to have, I don't know whether we started later and never quite picked up, but we don't seem to have gone for the old school classic West Coast as much as the States has.
I'd say like the one that's done at the Outpost at Three Hills. They have one on there that's pretty West Coasty, I guess, not on the extreme end. And I've certainly had another one from Gypsy Hill that was again similar, sort of more inspired by Pliny, I think. So
yeah, I mean, hopefully with beers like Oregon Trail and stuff coming through and becoming more popular, I mean, hopefully the West Coast will come back around. And it's probably worth mentioning that the hazies, especially in the UK, tend to be seasonal. Like a lot of hazies, it tends to be more about what's the latest hop, and how can we use that. So they definitely tend to be seasonal. Right. So how do you brew one? There are a couple of key sort of guidelines that I guess influence all aspects of the process. The first, you're going to be using loads and loads of malt, an awful lot of malt, and all of it, unlike a barley wine, needs to be tamed and really put into the background of the beer. So attenuation is going to be absolutely key. And then secondly, you're going to use not quite as much by weight, but more hops than you've probably ever used in any beer before. And those you need to bring to the foreground whilst managing just like the simple amount of plant matter and risk of, all the risks and the problems that carries. And those two sort of guiding principles, you'll sort of see in every area of the brewing process. They've affected every sort of single part of the process. But those are your two guiding principles. Fair to say, James? Is there anything?
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah, you wanna drive the as much attenuation as you can, because otherwise it's going to end up tasting like a sweet mess, and then get as much of the way of hops into it as you can. I mean, this is just talking about the style. It's kind of the American thing of take something and make it more. So this it doesn't just so it's more hops, obviously more malt in it, but that does mean you really have to drive the attenuation as hard as you can. So yeah, and the other side is then how do you separate all of those hops from your precious beer?
Yeah, question there. I don't know if it's going to come up later. How do you drive the attenuation of such a high gravity beer?
Excellent question, Paul. And yes, that is all that is all coming up. So we'll, in fact, if I move on to the next slide, you'll see that we come onto the Malt Bill, and already we're talking about how do you make sure that that's as dry as possible. But it like I say, in almost every single step, there is something in there to try and drive attenuation. So just moving on to your Malt Bill, there's going to be an awful lot of malt going. So there is really very little need for specialty malts. Many of the examples, many commercial examples only use pale. If you really did want some old school, proper old school backbone in there, you'd be best looking to something like Munich or Vienna for it. So maybe for a bit more breadiness or a bit of toastiness, but without that crystal character, which even in a double IPA gets cloying very, very quickly. For a hazy, you'd still want a chunk of the malt bill to be flaked, unmalted grains. But as James said, it's not you're not looking to brew something big and sweet. It's not a barley wine, and crystal malt's really kind of the last thing you want to be adding, given that all the attenuation is working to try and get rid of some of those raisiny, sweeter flavors.
Yeah, in terms of the malts, you're not really searching to add body here, because you're going to get the body from the sheer gravity of the thing,
Yeah.
and sweetness as well. So if you're adding a lot of oats, I'm not sure like how much you're gonna get out of it, other than a very sticky mash.
And like you mentioned, James, so alcohol itself brings the perception of sweetness. So a dextrose addition is very, very standard to try and help dry the beer out, probably up to around about 10%. Before you might start noticing, again, issues in the fermentation, but that will help drive attenuation in the malt bill. If you've got a small mash tun, or you're looking to make a bigger volume, this is the kind of beer that you could add the idea the paler the better, but you could add DME to. And again, I'd probably limit that to 10%. You could also boil a bit longer, but I think you need to be very careful about adding too much color. So I probably wouldn't go too much over 90 minutes. That probably depends as well on your element as well, how well it spreads the heat out, but you need to be careful not to add too much color or flavor through the boil.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of add to that. I wouldn't worry too much around adding certainly 10% dextrose and maybe even a little bit more, if you want to just boost the gravity, because there's an awful lot going to be going on in this beer, and DME is fine, but it always adds a little bit of the sort of sweetness to it. But yeah, either way, I think if you're struggling to get up on efficiency, which is always the difficult bit with a beer this big, certainly my mash tun gets topped out by this, and I have to sort of put some grain in the second pot as well, to be able to get the most out of it. The difficulty with this is you're going to be chasing efficiency, just simply with the sheer volume of grain that you've got is going to be causing a drop in efficiency. So do whatever you need to, basically, and probably don't try and make things harder than they need to be.
Is it a candidate for a reiterated mash with such a high gravity?
I've never done one.
I think depending on your system, Peter, yeah, absolutely. I think any of those techniques that are that will help you give you a leg up for the gravity, assuming that you want a particular, especially if you're shooting for a bigger volume, then yeah, I definitely use them. Like James, I would probably be, like I said, I'd probably be a bit careful with DME. I've used it before, and I think sometimes even in barley wines, if the DME has a bit of color to it, you can sort of start tasting it. But yeah, I think a reiterative mash would work well with this.
Peter, have you done a reiterated mash?
What is it? What's a reiterative mash?
Well, as I understand it, is you kind of split your grain in two, and then you mash it one lot, and then you take the wort from that and use it to basically mash into the second lot of grain with it.
Yeah, I've done that actually. A double mash thing in the brown wines. Yeah, it works well.
Yes, I have, and what I found was I split the grain bill exactly as you said. So I mashed the first one, I sparged the first one, and then I took that out, and then I put the other half of the grist in, Then I mashed that in the wort from the first mash, but I didn't sparge the second mash to keep the gravity high. Now, admittedly, I might have lost. I think I might have lost about 5% of my normal efficiency, but that wasn't a huge deal. And I used. I was making a barley wine, and I used number 3 invert and sugar in the boil. So, yeah, I got to 1003 without too many dramas. So if you've only got I've got a homemade single vessel system. If you've got a smaller system, it may well be a viable way of getting up to that gravity. That's why I mentioned it.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, it would be a good technique for that.
And I know we'll get to techniques and process in a bit, but it's a bit difficult to cut any corners with a beer like this. It's going to be a challenging beer to brew.
Yeah, +1. Right, hopping. So we'll deal with the hop side first. So first of all, your utilization is going to be lower due to the gravity of the wort. So you're going to need a lot of hops in order to keep a hop forward character in the beer. You're basically fighting against a bunch of factors here. And also the body of the beer and the sort of the size of the malt flavor is going to immediately start competing with any hop flavors and reduce your perception of IBUs and of aroma as well. Using more hops is going to mean obviously more plant material in the beer. It's going to soak up the beer and reduce your yield. And it's also you're going to run the risk, if you're not careful, of tannins, astringency from tannins. So there's a few tricks you can use, but there's a couple of the newer hop extracts are particularly good. So on the bittering side, Flex is a really good product. It's more viscous and easier to use than the CO2 extracts. And Flex is about 65% alpha acids. So very quickly you can, and it's a pourable liquid. So it's not going to soak up any of your wort. And the other thing is its bitterness utilization is also higher anyway. So you can reduce your overall bittering addition by about 10 to 20%. So that goes in at the beginning of the boil. In fact, the bottom picture you can see there is my boil after the Flex had gone in. And it really did give this sort of interest, a very interesting sort of foam on the top there, which would, had a really silky, luxurious texture to it and absolutely stank of pine. It was quite something. And then as you work your way through, quite often then you won't use, again, because of volume, you won't use any hops then, or you'd be unlikely to use many hops until right at the end of the process. So another really good product then for the whirlpool is Incognito. And that again is it's not quite a liquid, it's sort of a sticky, waxy, semi-liquid, I suppose, depending on how warm it gets. And that's 52% alpha acids. So again, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. It's about a 1:6 replacement ratio. So a gram of that is worth 6 grams, roughly 6 grams of hops. So again, you are getting maximum bang for your buck. Now, alongside those, it's probably going to be a good idea to use some, I won't say real hops, that sounds wrong, but either some basically some pellets of some description. So again, some of the more concentrated pellets, the cryo hops or the Lupamax ones would be a great candidate here. Again, just so you're putting as little plant material in the beer as possible. And even with that, you'll see from the recipes, the amount of hops you're putting in the beer is just a huge amount. So it's about combining some of these products with pellets just to again get a mix of flavors from my perspective.
I think particularly for the bittering, it's worth using as high alpha acid as you can, and because I mean you potentially want to do a longer boil. I don't mean like 4 hours, but an hour and a half or something like that, just to help with the, again, help concentrate the sugars and gain some efficiency back through sparging your mash a bit more. But that means you're potentially boiling, with the amount of IBUs you want to get, you potentially boiling quite a lot of plant matter for quite a long time. So flex is quite a nice way of handling that as an alternative. The CO, as Ian mentioned, like I've got a little bottle of flex here. For in terms of bang for your buck, I think actually these bottles, they cost I think about £5, £4 or £5 for a little bottle, and into a into my sort of normal size batch, which would be about 21, 22 litres into the fermenter. That would give me from a 90-minute boil about 85 IBUs from just dumping this whole little bottle in. So it works quite well. The alternative CO2 extract, ideally you need to dissolve it in some alcohol or hot wort or something like that. Otherwise it sort of sits on top of the wort and then sticks to the side of the kettle and doesn't actually go into the beer. Whereas the flex seems to dissolve fairly easily, although it's still worth taking one of those steps to sort of pre-dissolve it a little bit, just to help it in there. Yeah.
It's definitely not the time for any sort of 5% alpha acid English hops, and definitely not the time for leaf hops. You're really going for, like James said, higher alpha as possible. It's also probably worth thinking in terms of your recipe. The style of hops that you use will also affect perceived bitterness. So the sort of the more resinous, old school hops are going to give an impression of bitterness faster than some of the fruitier varieties.
Equally, I think there's probably going to be some of those fruity varieties which are not always best suited to high bittering, that might end up with a certain harshness. But a lot of the sort of old school US hops seem to work pretty well as bittering hops, just as well as they do later on in the boil.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, Galaxies, I always find one that can be a bit rough if there's too much of it in the beer. Right, so then you've got your malt in, you've got your hot side done, and you're cooling things down yeast-wise. So you're going to be looking for a neutral, highly attenuative yeast here that's high ABV tolerance. So something like Nottingham or any of the Chico strains. If you're looking at hazies, some of the English, the more attenuative English strains are popular for those. Like all high ABV beers, the risk of underpitching in terms of both quantity and health is exaggerated, and you can easily end up with the beer stalling or off flavors from a struggling yeast. So you're going to need an awful lot of yeast, a massive amount of yeast. You could put together a starter, but it would be expensive, and it would require, either a few flasks or vessels, and maybe you could even make it a corny. It's much easier to brew a simple starter beer, something sub 6%, let's say, a pale ale, anything like that, and then dump straight onto the yeast cake of that.
Yeah, I think the general danger from over pitching is the beer just ends up a bit bland and boring because there's a lack of any kind of yeast character to it. But that's not really an issue here because you're going to have lots of character from elsewhere. So a full yeast cake is really not an issue. And in fact, I would kind of recommend it that you just line up another beer to brew 2 weeks beforehand. Brew something basic, a cream ale or a light pale ale or something like that. And I often brew a cream ale just simply so it's sort of a counterpoint to the triple IPA. And yeah, then you can just go pretty much the whole yeast cake, drop your triple IPA straight onto that. If you're doing a starter, you're probably, the amount of starter wort you're going to end up with, you probably end up you want to do a starter, crash it out in the fridge, dump off the supernatant and take the yeast and then put that in a sort of sterilized jar or something like that, and then do another starter and another starter, and you'd end up doing quite a lot to be able to get it to that point. So I definitely think a almost full yeast cake from another batch is worth doing.
It's the easiest way. Yeah, definitely.
And you get more beer that way.
Kvike could be an interesting option. It's pretty ABV tolerant and it's nice and attenuative. And for some of the Kvikes, I would imagine, well, in fact, I know already that the fruit flavors can play quite well. Some of the orangier Kvikes could work quite well in a beer like this. But I think you would need to know that you like the Kvike tang, I suppose, because I think with a beer of this strength, you're probably likely to, it's probably likely to be accentuated. But that could be an interesting option. In terms of your water, you're looking for a profile that's going to accentuate the crispness of the beer and the hop flavor. So you're looking to get a load of sulfates in there. Dosing levels of sulfate, final levels of sulfate vary massively. So, for instance, Mitch Steele recommends somewhere between 110 and 140, and Denicon wants to shoot for 350. I think I ended up with about 250 ppm, which gave me a calcium level of about 150. But yeah, there's a huge variety here, but you're definitely focusing on sulfates. I have read that depending on your water composition, if you've already got, if you're starting to get too much calcium and you still need sulfates, you could use Epsom salts to add the sulfates, but without the calcium. But I didn't need to do that, but I have read that does work.
Yeah, a little bit, I think. I wouldn't use a lot. Particularly the magnesium can end up with a sort of harsh bitterness, or at high levels is a laxative. At quite high levels though, so yeah.
Something you didn't ask for. So, and then in terms of mashing, so back to Paul's question earlier. So you're going to want to go low. I think I shot for around about 65 degrees and a long time. So I'd say minimum 2 hours. And I've read that actually the time can have a much bigger effect on how attenuative your wort is than the temperature. So this is a great candidate for an overnight mash, which I tend to do with most of my barley wines as well. And I think I've ended up getting down to 1003, even with WLP 002 on some double IPAs. So, you can end up with a very attenuative mash. And as James mentioned earlier, this isn't a time for cutting any corners. So really, if you can, you want to be fly sparging a beer like this to really try and get your efficiency up.
Yeah, I think on the mash point, I mean, when I did it, it was a 90-minute mash, which is longer than I would normally do, but it got the efficiency and the attenuation from it. So, but I also then did a full-on, I did a over an hour long sparge as well, which is normally I just sort of batch sparge. So I just sort of tip some water in, mix it in, and then drain it off again, which is not very efficient, but it's quick. Yeah, that was not the time to do it for this. So you're going to have a fairly long brew day. I mean, another option, as Peter mentioned earlier on, was a reiterated mash. So yeah, you can split your grain bill up and do multiple mashes with it. But either way, it's going to be a longer than normal brew day.
Yeah. One trick you can use, which I find works really well for a beer like this, is to use some external enzymes. So this is something that's been borrowed from the brute IPA style. So it's using an external enzyme. So in other words, it's not present in the malt already, and it's been derived from a fungus called, I think it's Aspergillus niger or something. And this enzyme is able to convert the unfermentable dextrins left by the alpha and the beta amylase into glucose, which then the yeast can convert fully. So all the available starch, potentially, depending on how you use the enzyme, can be converted into sugar. And again, it's not, depending on how you want to buy it, it's not an expensive edition. Interestingly, and I only found this out after using it a couple of times in the mash, it has a pretty mild action in the mash, actually. And if you want to really let it go to work in the mash, you need to be adding around about 2 to 4 mil per litre. Now I've added 1 mil per litre, which equated to popping 40 mil in. I can't remember how big the bottles are, the malt Miller cells. Are they about
15 mil.
15
I've
mil.
got one again. I've got a little one here.
Yeah.
Amyloid
I dumped one of those in the mash of a brut IPA, and I think it got down. It only went down to 10.10, I think, or 10.8. No, nothing crazy at all. 10.8, I think, 10.7. And I used 40 mil, 1 milliliter in the last triple IPA I did. And again, that only went down to 10.08. So it can be quite mild in the mash, but you can also use it once you've got your boil kettle full, before it is anywhere near boil temperature, so sub 70 degrees, you can use it in a boil kettle. And I know that Lee has used it in the boil kettle for a brut IPA, and his did go down right the way down to 10.01 or something along those lines. So when it's not diluted by all that grain, it clearly has a much more powerful effect. And that's a really interesting place to add it. Probably in the mash, I'd say, is almost like you're using it as insurance, but you're not going to end up with rocket fuel. Once you start adding it to the, so pre-boil, just to the worts at that stage, then you're much more likely to get an awful lot more action. And if you use it in the FV, like you might do for a brut IPA, then the enzyme's in there for good. So it's going right the way down, and you only need a very small quantity then. But then your issues are, well, for a beer like this, you'd probably end up with petrol. You could literally run your car off it. And you run the risk of carrying over your enzyme, not just into the finished beer, especially if you're bottling, but also it's sticking around on your brew kit. So you've got to be quite careful with it in the FB.
There's also a danger in the fermenter, particularly if you add it late on. So basically, if fermentation is done or pretty much done, the danger is that you because you're kicking off fermentation again, you'll produce the yeast will produce a whole load of diacetyl, which won't necessarily get cleaned up again. So and there are commercial brewers which do use it in that way in the fermenter. But then they also have other products that they can add in, or other enzymes. Basically, there's one called Maturex, which removes diacetyl. We don't have the availability of that yet, I would highly suggest either using it, as Ian said, pre-boil, basically. I don't know, maybe you could use it at the beginning of the ferment, but the danger is, it's going to keep going, and it's going to sort of dry out to, well, quite possibly below 1. So you end up with it won't be a particularly dry beer simply because of where it started, but it will be very strong.
Yeah, I think I managed to get hold of a litre over here for it was super cheap. It's one of those products that if you don't want to buy it in tiny amounts, is very, very cheap. So the amount you need for the mash, which turns out in my case would need to be around 160 mil, to really start getting some action going, is an enormous amount. So that's quite useful that it's cheap. I still think that an overnight mash started at 65 and then wrapped up is going to get you a very, very fermentable wort. You shouldn't really. I suspect the reasons why enzymes become popular with commercial brewers, of course, is that then they can do it quickly and they can stick to a 90-minute mash rather than, they're not doing overnight mashes clearly.
I didn't have a problem with the 90-minute mash personally, and I do normally do shorter than that. I got better than normal mash efficiency, but equally, I didn't get down into the 1010s or anything like that. My beer finished at 1022, but it started a lot higher as well. We'll get onto the details in a bit, but I think, I'm not planning to on redoing it, which I'm planning on doing soon. I'm not intending to actually use enzyme in the end. I want to try and make sure I can repeat it like I did the first time. And maybe in future versions, I'll try and dry it out further.
Well, I think Midsteel reckons he does about 65 degrees and he does 2 hours, and he reckons that's enough to dry it right down. So
yeah, that's pretty much what I did.
That will be interesting to try.
Combine, I mean, a sparge, your conversion doesn't stop the moment you start sparging, because you might be sparging at sort of 75 or something like that, but it takes a while for it to all come up in temperature, if it does at all.
Yeah.
So you potentially, it is actually ultimately mashing for quite a long time.
Yeah. So then you've got it into the fermenter. In terms of oxygenating, if you have not used dry yeast, because of the gravity of the wort, absorption rates are going to be a lot less. So you probably need they recommend up to about 4 times the normal dose of oxygen to get enough in there. Similarly, they recommend using a couple of times the amount of yeast nutrient that you normally use, keep the yeast nice and healthy. And given the amount you're going to be pitching, that's probably pretty sensible. And then I think temperature control for both your initial stages of the fermentation to keep it nice and under control whilst it's you've got the forest fire going, and then also at the final stages when you're ramping up to try and clean the beer out and also crash everything out as tightly as possible. Temperature control at that stage is also going to be pretty important. Anything else on fermentation, James?
A couple of things. So yeah, yeast nutrient, definitely. I would definitely recommend it, particularly if you're going down the route of using a yeast cake, because that yeast will be tired out. It will have used up a lot of its resources. So worth sort of giving it a bit more in there to help it with the fermentation. One thing on the discussion about sort of attenuation and enzymes and things like that, one thing obviously you need to take into account is how attenuative your yeast is. This is where the sort of highly attenuative American ale yeasts, USO5, Yeast 1056, WLP 001, do come into their own, because they do ferment quite dry. They're quite tolerant of the longer chain sugars, so will do quite well. Any yeast which is going to be slightly less attenuative than that is potentially where you might want to start thinking about using enzymes to give it a hand. So it's going to be a combination of which yeast you use and all the other things you do and whether you're going to use enzymes to help drive down that attenuation.
Yeah. Okay. So just moving on to dry hopping. So you will need a lot of dry hops, an awful lot of dry hops, but it's worth remembering the studies by Thomas Shellhammer, which showed that above 8 grams a litre, the intensity starts to drop off, and you end up with some of the characteristics of the hops, some of the flavours coming out that you might not want, and the nice, the fruitier flavours start to drop off. So worth playing around with, but it's also, if you're not going to go mad on spending, it's useful to know that above that amount, it's not been shown to add that much. It's also interesting time to play around with some of the more modern dry hopping techniques. So keeping the beer relatively cool, maybe around 40 degrees, and doing a shorter dry hop just for a few days. Again, studies have shown that within the first, I think it's like 72 hours, all of the oils that are going to be extracted have been extracted, and that after that point, the plant material actually starts reabsorbing some of those oils. You can even try dry hopping at much cooler temperatures. I've tried at sort of 1.5 degrees, and for just a few days. I must admit, I sort of like I like the combination of flavors you get, perhaps with doing some at 14 and some at lower temperature, just to try and layer the flavors a bit. But that works quite well. Similarly, a lot of the pros are now recirculating the hops, possibly via pumps. I probably wouldn't advise that because of the risks of O2 infection. O2 and infections. A much better way that, in fact, a lot more of them use would be rousing the hops with CO2, which you can do even if you get a bucket, just by giving it a bit of a swirl carefully, really carefully. Just to rouse the hops, stop them just dropping straight to the bottom and sitting there and doing nothing.
Yeah, I think talking to you saying about like the sort of shorter dry hopping times, sort of talks that a bit, and obviously you dump the hops in and then they just sort of drop to the bottom of your fermenter or keg or whatever, and they're not really doing much once they're there. But I think a lot of the best stuff obviously comes out as it initially sort of drops through the beer, and then I don't know how much more you're getting after that point. So if you can rouse or pump or something like that, then you're going to get more. But equally, I think a couple of days it's gonna do it for you.
That 8 grams a litre, Ian, is that for triple IPA particularly, or is that a general rule of thumb?
No, that was a general rule of thumb, and I think the beer, I can't remember the beer they used to test it on, but it wasn't an extreme beer by any means. I think I suppose the temptation is with trying to get that hop flavour into a beer that is this big on malt, is just to go utterly berserk, but that limit still stands. I think it's just useful, sort of number to keep your eye on, when you're trying to balance what you're going to put in the whirlpool and what you're going to use for dry hopping. But it's a good study.
I would, again, like, it's one of those things where I guess it depends upon how efficient you are at extracting the best from the hops. Obviously, if you dump a whole load in and they drop to the bottom and don't go anywhere, then I don't know how much you're going to get out of it. So maybe you'll need more than that. I think I was surprised when we had our tasting sort of sessions with Howling Hops, and the amount of hops they were talking about adding was pretty insane. So
that's what I was thinking. They were 10, 12 gram a litre in their dry.
Yeah, I think it was like the brown ale or something like that was up at sort of 8 or 9 grams a litre. So yeah, I think try it, see. But there is an upper limit.
It's ideal for doing a little test on, isn't it? Splitting out a couple of batches at that point, or a batch, at fermentation, and doing, I don't know, 4 grams, 8 grams, 16 grams or something with smaller amounts of beer, so that it's not insanely expensive. But I'll try and I think I've got a PDF of the study actually. I'll try and put it up. It's a really good study. Quite encouraging if you are looking to not go berserk on the hops in the dry hop.
Can I just clarify the 8 grams per litre? Is that just in the dry hop? Because on hoppy ales would go up to 15 grams a litre, but that would be throughout the brew rather than just in the dry hopping stage. So is that just in dry hopping?
Just for the dry hop, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So you can, what you're going to get out of the whirlpool will be very different in character. Similarly, although it's not applicable to this particular beer, just because you end up with far too much material, the layering that you can do, sort of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, which I know a lot of American brewers have moved away from, but I think that gives a much better layering of hop flavors and much more complex. So yes, you can absolutely end up with much higher rates.
Yeah, I agree. Lovely, thank you.
I was going to say my recipe was 500 grams of hops into not just for the dry hop, for the whole thing, into about 21 litres, plus a 15 ml of the flex extract, which I think is worth another 150 grams of hops. So yeah, lots.
That would hurt.
It's probably worth mentioning that even the West Coast examples will end up getting multiple additions. So a couple of hop additions is really useful. I think both James and I ended up doing a sort of a standard dry hop addition in the FV, and then I know both of us have tried then adding a keg hopping addition, which I think is a really good one for this. Well, I think it's a really good one if you can do it very carefully for this beer, because then you get super fresh dry hop aroma right in the beer just as you're serving it, which I think is amazing. But equally, the risk of adding oxygen there is pretty critical. And I ended up with a couple of kegs worth of this beer, including a keg that I brought back from BrewCon. And by the time it got back here, it was definitely oxidizing. So need to be careful with that, but we'll come on to that in a minute. In terms of once the beer is fermented, a couple of brewers are trying something quite interesting, which is acidifying the beer post fermentation to bring it down to about 4.5 pH in order to create. Well, basically, when you dry hop, and especially you dry hop a lot, it naturally raises the pH of the beer. And this has definitely a couple of effects on flavor. The first is the lower the pH, the crisper and the more lively the beer tastes. And the higher the pH, the duller it, the less lively it is. And other research has also shown that your perceived bitterness increases by about 2 IBUs for every 0.1 increase in pH. So like I say, some breweries then like Julian Schrager at Beechwood acidifies his IPAs to produce a sort of a smoother bitterness. He reckons it gives a smoother bitterness. So anyway, I dug my fresh keg of Triple out of the fridge over the weekend. I actually had this presentation lined up for last week because I got the date completely wrong, but it was quite useful, so that it gave me another week to play around. So over the weekend, I dug the Triple out. It turned out it was already sitting at 4.5 pH, but just out of interest, I took it down to 4.15. You can see there, and then I tasted the two side by side, and the lower pH beer, you could tell a mile off. Even switching the glasses around and messing around, it was definitely, it was sort of brighter, a bit fruitier. The finish, probably because at that level, it was probably a bit too low, but you're approaching probably even a little bit of a sort of a zingy, slightly even tart finish, even with phosphoric. But it also gave the impression of being a lighter beer, slightly less syrupy, I suppose. So it was really interesting. So I would definitely check the pH of a beer like that and bring it down using a bit of acid. Post-fermentation, obviously some of the hazes are also going to get a lactose addition. I'll probably leave that comment there. And and also in terms of your carbonation level, for a beer like this, you want it to be at a reasonably high carbonation level to keep the beer lively and crisp. Right, is that the end of all the brewing comments that we were going to add? I think it is.
I think you're talking about a bit of process as well next.
Oh yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. So yeah, just I guess sort of a little bit of a summary of all of that, of all of those sort of how to brew, the different areas of the process. It's achieving the attenuation, I think, is absolutely key to this beer. I think if it doesn't attenuate, you've basically brewed yourself an American barley wine. So any of the little tricks you can add, even if it's, as I said, even if it's just almost as an insurance, I think is money well spent, especially given the amount of money this beer is going to cost you anyway. £5 on a little bit of enzymes and a mash just to make sure that you do get down is not going to be a big investment. I know James hates this, but I sometimes naughtily use hop creep as a fermentation aid if I end up with a beer that hasn't gone as far as I want. So I'll stay up at 20 degrees, I'll dump in my dry hop, I'll watch the process kick off, the fermentation kick off, but I will leave it in there quite a long time at that point, at least a week, to make sure that it cleans up. But I've used that with a few double IPAs and it's worked really well. On a beer like this, your yeast will be absolutely knackered at the end. I don't think there's any way, even if you got hop creep, I think you will end up then with diacetyl on it. It won't be able to clean up after itself because it'll be so utterly stuffed. Yeah.
Yeah, I can taste hop creep quite often in beers because where the dry hops have been added and it's kicked off fermentation again, there's just this touch of diacetyl in there. So I don't know whether it just needs longer to be taken out, but certainly dropping the temperature a little bit before dry hopping helps avoid that. So
and yeah, like we said earlier, one of the biggest keys to attenuation is just going to be building, however you do it, having lots and lots of healthy yeast is probably the biggest deal breaker there. And then the other side of the coin is going to be how you deal with those hops. So depending on your system, the amount of hops you're dealing with here could be a real issue. How did you deal with yours, James?
So multiple things really. Certainly, so one thing is you mentioned already the sort of various replacements for hops. So the Flex, the Incognito, potentially even Spectrum as well, which is the sort of dry hop replacement. All a good idea because all those hops in there are soaking up your precious wort or your precious beer, which is going to take quite it's already expensive to brew that to that strength. Certainly use pellets, not leaf, because the leaf just picks up so much more. But when it comes to actually there's going to be a difficult bit when you get to your kettle of how you separate the amount of hops you've got in there from the wort. And the way I did it for this was basically I had a brew in a bag, nylon bag, which I boiled for a little bit, and then I used it to line my fermenter. And at the end of the boil, I basically, after I chilled it all, I just opened up the tap and dumped pretty much everything into the fermenter, and then threw the bag, and then could pick up the bag as it all drained out. And I'm going to say I gave it a squeeze just to get that good sort of hoppy wort out. I'm not embarrassed to admit that. Well, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that, but yeah. So that's the way I dealt with it there. And then on the drier hop side, like Ian said, I split it into two dry hops, one in the fermenter, one in the keg. And again, the keg one was, I think I did it in sort of hop sock that was suspended in the keg. So again, sort of I could just pull it out, and I don't think I squeezed that. I'd let it drain very briefly, but being paranoid about oxygen getting in, I didn't leave it too much. So just sort of pulled it out and sealed up the keg, and repurged it with CO2. Yeah, so those are the sort of main things to worry about. You're going to end up with hop soup at the end of the boil. So how you got to figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying as well in the fermenter before you dry hop, this is definitely a time for dumping your yeast. Definitely not a time for hanging on to it. So in terms of ease of getting the hop flavors out and not having them submerged, but also then if you are going to dump off the hops at the end, you're going to end up with cement if you leave the yeast in there. So definitely get rid of that. And then a bit like the NEPAs, you really want to avoid oxygen at all costs. This is going to be a tricky beer. Not impossible. I wouldn't say it quite as tricky as a NEPA to bottle, but not far off. So it's a great candidate for kegging. And when you're kegging, you want to be purging, very carefully, either multiple purges of gas or filling up the star sound and pushing it all out to make sure that you've got rid of as much oxygen as possible. Partly actually with this beer, especially for a home brewer, a bit like I found, it's going to be around for a while. If you're getting through this beer quickly, you've probably got other issues. But mine is valiantly hanging around at the moment. So yeah, avoiding, which is actually where keg hopping is quite good because I only keg topped one keg, so the other keg has remained virgin, which is quite useful.
I'd say as well, like, and by kegging as well, it doesn't need to be in an expensive corny with your CO2 setup and stuff like that. I think it's perfectly doable in a pressure barrel kind of thing. And that will help sort of avoid a lot of oxygen as well, just simply because the sort of ratio of headspace to beer is a lot lower than a bottle.
Yeah.
I think bottling this straight from the fermenter is difficult.
Yeah.
Unless you've got some amazing way of doing it that avoids oxygen in the bottle.
Yeah. It's also a bit like the New England's. It's a beer that's worth drinking fresh. I can definitely tell how the beer has changed since I brewed it in October with mine. So it's definitely worth drinking fresh. First couple of weeks, there'll definitely be a bit of hot burn, but I reckon somewhere between 2 weeks and 6 weeks is optimal. And it's a great beer for that. A great beer if you don't fancy having a few.
James, I frequently bottle directly from the fermenter using a counter pressure bottle filler.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way of doing it. If you can, it's just
no pressure there. A little bit of blanket CO2 on top of the fermenter, and just let gravity push it into the bottle after having purged it with the CO2 first. Worked well.
Yeah, if you can do that. I mean, I was thinking it's as much for people that don't have CO2 available. It's the difficult bit, really. So if you can, then in those cases I would look at, doing everything you can to keep air away from the beer. So I would, if you don't have that, I would use something like a pressure barrel or something like that, but fill it right up basically.
Would you need to reseed with the bottling yeast if you're bottling straight away?
Possibly, but I think, to be honest, there should, as long as you're not leaving it for months and you're using a fairly a yeast that survived that far, then with a bit of sugar in it, it should be fine.
My own experience of that was with a barley wine, 12% barley wine, and I did need to reseed. The yeast was absolutely knackered. Probably worth a test. Not impossible.
Get a pack of bottling yeast and then just like some tweezers, and you just drop like a little grain of yeast into each bottle.
Yeah.
Along with some sugar solution, that'll do it. Yeah,
it's definitely not a beer I would want undercarbonated. I haven't bottled for a long time. I didn't used to even add any extra sugar just because I like the lower levels. But it's definitely not a bottle of beer that you would want on the lower end of carbonation. It's nice when it's lively.
Have you ever used citric acid as an oxygen scavenger?
No, I've not used any scavenging. I know James has played around with metabisulfate, wasn't it, James?
Yes, it worked terribly. The danger with a metabisulfite is if the yeast is not finished fermenting 100%, then it will turn the sulfite into hydrogen sulfide, and then your beer smells of eggs. So difficult. I've heard of people using ascorbic acid, I think it is.
What they do commercially.
As another option, but I think the best thing you can do is just avoid it in the first place. And the bottles anyway, with the crown caps, you've got they all have the oxygen scavenging liners in them. So worth trying those.
Is it something you've tried, Mark?
Yeah, I can't remember where I read it now, but they were recommending a mixture of sort of Camden tablet and citric acid. I've used it.
I've heard of ascorbic acid, but not citric acid.
Pretty sure it was citric. Yeah, but it didn't do any harm anyway. Let's put it like that.
I wonder what the acid does then. Just thinking as well about post fermentation acidification anyway that you might be doing on a beer like this. I wonder what is it, that particular acid?
I have no idea what the sort of chemistry is involved.
Yeah. Okay. So then, in terms of recipes and experiences. James, do you want to spin us through yours?
Cool. Okay, yeah. So this was my version of kind of inspired by Pliny the Younger, which I brewed for my 40th birthday last year, and in February last year, and it's coming around again, so I'm going to brew it again. Obviously, in terms of numbers, this is kind of on the extreme end of things of 11.7% ABV. The original gravity was 1108. And yeah, the final gravity came down to 1022, but not quite the 10s or below that Ian's suggesting. And theoretically well over 200 IBUs, but it didn't taste like that at all. And also I think it didn't, given the high original gravity, the final gravity was not really an issue at the end of the day. My malt bill was entirely inspired by, again, I followed not exactly, but similar to Pliny the Younger. So it was mostly pale malt with a bit of dextrin, a bit of caramel, and then in the boil it had some dextrose sugar just to help bump up the gravity and thin things out a bit. I don't really know, to be honest, the sense of using the dextrin or the caramel. I think it's probably absolutely fine without, but that was the suggestion, so I used a bit anyway. In terms of then the sort of water profile, Ian mentioned earlier on sort of a higher level of sulfate, so I concentrated mainly on that. I think it was mostly sort of a mixture of tap water and a bit of RO, and then yeah, some gypsum and calcium chloride to, in fact, I think it was, yeah, a bit of gypsum, bit of calcium chloride to sort of bump things up on those to get sort of a 3-to-1 ratio of sulfate to chloride. The yeast was just an entire yeast cake from a cream ale I'd made of Yeast 1056. I like 1056 over the other sort of American ale strains because it just actually seems cleaner. I've had some little bits of phenol and stuff like that from USO5. So yeah, but I've had a lot of success with 1056, so that's the one I stick to. In terms of mash, just 90 minutes at 65, and then said a 1 hour plus sparge. Try and take it fairly easy just to try and recover as much back of efficiency as possible. And then the boil, I've already mentioned there was a little bit of, I stuck in the hops, for sort of tried to stick to most of the American traditional piney hops, so Columbus, Simcoe, Centennial. I think were the only ones I used for this, as well as a bit of the flex extract. In future, I'm adding swapping out a couple of those as well, and adding in a bit of Chinook, and possibly something else as well. I think we'll see about that. But yeah, small amount of Columbus first water hop. Lots use the flex extract for 90 minutes, and then a little bit more Columbus at 45 minutes. The main thing though is that was all it was really in the boil until post boil, cool things down to 90 degrees, and then quite a large amount of Simcoe, Centennial, and Columbus. Strained it all through a bag, as I just mentioned as well, to get all of that lovely hop juice out. And then a bit of pure oxygen, and then fermented it for at 17 degrees for a few days, and then gradually ramped up the temperature. But basically started at low to try and avoid it going crazy. 1056 is quite temperature tolerant on the lower end, so there's not too much of a problem with that. But with that amount of sugar in there, it's kind of, there's always a danger it's going to take off, get quite warm and estery. So I've avoided that. Towards the end, I ramp it up to 21 degrees. Total length of the ferment was 2 weeks before it was pretty much finished, which is quite a lot longer than I would normally have for a beer that's sort of ready to go with pure oxygen. But yeah, so it took a total of about 2 weeks to ferment. And then double dry hopped, once in the fermenter, once in the keg. So the fermenter, I crashed the beer down to 14 degrees, added the hops at that point, once it was down to 14 degrees, then crashed it down again down to, I think, 2 or 3 degrees for a couple of days, just to help drop all the hops out. Transferred it across to the keg, and where I added another dry hop there for 2 days before pulling that out. And that was it, really. So yeah, it just ended up at quite a high gravity to start off with, and a fairly decent sort of final gravity. And I sent out quite a lot of bottles to other people, just to try and spread the love, make sure everybody got to have a try of it. Yeah, and I was really pleased with it in the end of the day. It was a complete sort of crazy, I just want to brew this and take my time over it. So I did, and it worked out pretty well. I was really happy with it. It was, I'll say it was fairly sweet, but it wasn't cloying at all. And just with the sheer amount of bitterness in there, it did offset it nicely. So yeah, I think it took in total about 4 weeks from brewing to when it was just about sort of starting to get ready to drink. Partly because of the keg dry hop. I think it was initially, there was a load of sort of fine hop dust left in the bottom of the keg, which was obviously quite grassy. But once I'd sort of taken all that out, it was really nice. So yeah, I think it took me about 4 weeks to go from grain to glass at the end of the day. You mind going on a slide, please?
Yep.
I've got a few pictures here. Yeah, so just a couple of things, like yeah, the post boil, I said, dumped in 210 grams of pellet hops, just post boil, so it's sort of almost a 3/4 of a pint of pellet hops, which is quite a lot into the volume. Said the end of it, use some pure oxygen via the rig I've got to help give it the best start I could. And then just I mentioned the flex extract earlier on, but just on that right hand one, you can see sort of the little brown dots all over the side of the boiler. That seemed to be sort of the little bits of flex extract sort of stuck to the side of the boiler. So I think most of it got out and was useful, but I don't know how much it was sort of left stuck on the side of the kettle. I know certainly with CO2 extract, that stuff you really need to dissolve it in advance. I've heard of people sort of taking the little bottles of CO2 extract and they just pop them in their mash for 20 minutes to help sort of heat it up so it liquefies and makes it easier to dissolve. Or other people sort of dissolve it in a little bit of vodka. But yeah, I was just interested to see how that sort of been left behind. So yeah, that was my beer.
So first I brewed was in 2018, which was actually not a mistake, but I thought I was brewing a double IPA, and it ended up a little bit bigger. So the OG wasn't crazy, 1080. This is the one that I did the overnight mash on, so no enzymes, but still managed to get down to, on this one, 1005, 100 odd IBUs. And the finished beer reminded me a bit of just a much bigger version of Jaipur. It was quite dry. Yeah, it was quite dry and crisp, and very drinkable. You didn't have a sense like you would do with a barley wine of a big, there's no big syrupy body. The malt bill was very simple. Some lager malt, pale malt, half and half, and then about 10% dextrose. I dumped that onto a yeast cake of 002, which worked really well. Majored on the sulfate, but not crazily though, 2 to 1, I suppose. For this one, I didn't use any hop products. At that point, I didn't know about any of them. So I just went for Columbus for bittering. And the rest of the hops, a bit like James, I sort of bookended. So I went for Whirlpool and dry hopping. I think that was probably, again, more by chance that I stopped at 8 grams per litre than any knowledge. And I think I mixed up about 2/3 old school C hops, so Columbus and Chinook, and then 1/3 Citra, trying to add a little, just some tropical, just some interesting fruitier top notes, but not, it was still mainly a very old school flavour. And then last year in October, I brewed again, a slightly bigger FG. I was hoping to get down lower, so I was just ideally shooting for sort of 11%, but I didn't get down as low, even with quite a lot of enzymes in the mash, although I now realise that I was probably still underdosing those. But the mash was only an hour on this one, so that's quite an interesting comparison between an hour's mash and an overnight one. The beer turned out definitely heavier and richer. Despite that, the IBUs that I ended up with, I don't know whether the, looking back at some of the information about Flex, because its utilization is more efficient, I wonder whether I actually got a lot more than IBUs than I bargained for, and they were pretty high. It was borderline, really, it's a very bitter beer. And for this one, again, kept the malt bill quite simple. Pale ale, what's that, 30% pale ale? No, that would be 30% lager, I think. Pills, sorry. 7% wheat, about not far off 10 dextrose again. And there we go for the mash. Like I mentioned, 60 minutes with some enzymes. I pitched about 3 packs equivalent of Nottingham, and I was talked into pitching some Verdant in. I probably wouldn't do that again. I think really the yeast, I'm not sure the Verdant is attenuative enough. From memory, from the talks we've had from Andrew at Lallemand, Verdant is one of the ones that, if I'm right, doesn't process all the maltose, is it? So I think
maltotriose.
Maltotriose. So I think I might have ended up getting left. I don't know. I'm just that was again, back to Paul's question, attenuation. If when I brew this again, I'll just do it all Nottingham or all 001 or something. Majored a bit more on the sulfate this time, which could explain the more bitter flavour of the beer. I, like James, went for Flex and about 40 grams of Columbus in a 40 litre batch, 35 litre batch. Did the same kind of trick, using mainly C hop, but then a little bit of Ella and Citra for, some fruity top notes. And like James, did a mixture of dry hopping and cake hopping. And yeah, they're definitely, it's definitely a beer I'll brew again. I really like it when you don't fancy drinking, like 3 pints of something at 5% or even less. It's a nice beer to mull over and just have one of. It's a very dangerous beer to try and finish the night on or do anything like that on. It tends to put you down very quickly if you develop a taste for it. But it's a fun beer to brew. And I think that is it. I'm pretty certain that's the last slide.
No, you got one more.
Another slide. So I'm just conscious of, the hazies. This is a very well-regarded hazy triple IPA from the States called Reuben's Triple Crush. So I managed to find a recipe for this. Again, the OG is not crazy, but you'll see that the FG here is quite a bit higher than for, let's say, a classic West Coast, and the IBUs down at 60 there are quite a lot less. Again, the hops make it a sort of stone fruit forward beer rather than pine or any of the danker notes you'd get off a West Coast. And you can see there from the Malt Bill that about, where are we? 15% of it is made up of various flaked grains. But they've added in a little bit of dextrose to sort of balance things out a bit. The mash temperature, you'll note, is quite a bit higher. Again, that would again explain the higher finishing gravity. So 67 is almost as nice as standard mash temperature, isn't it? So they've really not pushed attenuation there. London Ale 3, they have pulled the usual trick with the water profile of going more chloride, just to give that really smooth, full, rounded malt emphasizing water profile. And they've gone for Citra as their dry hop and Whirlpool hop, but I have never tried similar hazies. Some of them work, I find. Some of them work. I think for me, they still need to be maybe a bit more attenuated than this one. But they very quickly, I think, get cloying, and I don't find them as drinkable as the West Coast. The bitterness doesn't draw you in for more very quickly. They can become cloying, but be an interesting recipe to play around with. Any last thoughts, James, before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think there was one question which was from Mark, I presume it's Mark Sanderson, saying, if brewing a starter beer, I take it you brew it as pale as possible with no hops. I would avoid dry hops, and I probably wouldn't pitch it onto a stout, but to be honest, it wouldn't matter massively. But yeah, I'd certainly, when my starter beer was a cream ale, so yeah, it was pale, not too strong, and didn't have any dry hops in there, but I would certainly avoid dry hops in the fermenter. And yeah, probably a pale beer would be a good one as well. But what do you think, Ian?
I think the key for me would be to probably not to push above 6% to make sure the yeast is as healthy as possible. I don't think, like you said, I wouldn't do a stout, but neither would I worry too much about the color of it, particularly, especially if you manage to get all the beer off the top of it. I think if you were going to dry hop, it depends how you want to use your cake, doesn't it? So sometimes I've done it where I've actually dumped the cake off and then I've dry hopped. So, it depends what your brewing process is. Mine is to cool the beer right down. So in that case, I'd probably cool it down to 2 degrees, leave it for, 4 days. And then I dump the cake off into a big jar and stick that in the fridge. And then I've dry hopped and sort of redumped in the cake. So you're not actually pitching onto a cake, but you're using a whole brew's worth of yeast. So depending on what you've got planned, I don't think it would necessarily preclude doing a dry hop beer beforehand, but you'd have to be careful how you did it. Alternatively, I suppose you could do it. You could use a hop sock to do the dry hopping with, so you didn't end up with too much other material in the cake if you're doing it that way. So yeah, there are ways around it. I think it's probably more important that the beer is sub 6% and that your yeast there's a lot of it and it's nice and healthy.
Yeah, I guess you could also like move it off to a secondary or to a keg or whatever and dry hop it there if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So that's another way. But yeah, I would avoid having a bunch of hops left in the fermenter that you're then going to pop the new beer onto. And yeah, just keep it not too strong. And I think probably certainly my view of like brewing something that's sort of 4.5% is quite a nice counterpoint to have to your 12% monster that you're about to brew. So
yeah, absolutely. Palate once you've had it, if you can. Great. Oh well, thank you for that, James. Right, how do I stop sharing?
Does anybody have any other questions? No, you covered it perfectly, Ian.
I can't believe that.
Well, I think I was going to say, first of all, so thank you very much, Ian. I know originally I suggested, or it was talked about sort of doing this, and I said, yeah, let's do a presentation on it. And then Ian's actually done the whole presentation. So thank you very much, Ian, for that really good presentation. So thank you.
No worries, pleasure.
And I guess that sort of, we're kind of at the end of the meeting really. So at this point we can descend into whatever questions you want for Ian and or otherwise just general chatter. So I'm going to go and get a refill, and I'll be back in sort of 5 minutes or so, and then carry on really.